On a cold November morning in 1889, the Briar Hollow estate stood silent against the grey Massachusetts sky, its blackened walls still warm from the fire that had consumed it 3 days earlier. The blaze had taken everything: the grand ballroom where Boston's elite once danced, the library that housed 5 generations of family records, and the lives of 17 people trapped inside during a charity gala. Now, as investigators walked through the ruins, their boots crunching on debris, they discovered something that would haunt the small town of Ashford for decades to come. In the main hall, where marble floors had once gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the ashes had settled into patterns that resembled human faces, dozens of them, staring upward as if frozen in their final moments. But this wasn't supernatural. This was the beginning of a mystery that would reveal the darkest secrets of one of America's most respected families. Dr. Henry Blackwood arrived at the estate on November 15th, sent by the Massachusetts Fire Investigation Bureau to determine the cause of the catastrophe. At 42, he had investigated over 200 fires across New England, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw at Briar Hollow. The faces in the ash weren't mystical apparitions. They were the result of a horrifying reality. The extreme heat had caused the marble floor to crack and buckle, creating depressions where ash, soot, and the remains of the victims had collected. The human eye, always searching for patterns, saw faces in these formations. But Henry knew there was more to this story. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, and the main exits had been locked from the outside. Sarah Winters, a young journalist from the Boston Herald, had been covering society events for 2 years when she heard about the Briar Hollow tragedy. She convinced her editor to let her investigate, sensing that the official story, a kitchen accident, didn't add up. Sarah arrived in Ashford on the same day as Dr. Blackwood, and their paths crossed at the town's only inn. The innkeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Price, a woman in her 60s who had worked at Briar Hollow for 30 years before retiring, seemed eager to talk. Over tea, she told them about the estate's owner, Richard Thornton, a railroad magnate whose wealth came from questionable labor practices. She mentioned the workers who had died building his lines, the families left destitute, and the growing anger in towns across Massachusetts. That evening, Henry and Sarah walked the perimeter of the destroyed estate together, comparing notes. The fire's intensity suggested accelerants had been used, and witness statements revealed that several strangers had been seen near the property the day before the gala. The locked exits indicated premeditation. As they examined the ash patterns more closely under lamplight, Henry explained the science behind pareidolia, how the human brain creates meaning from random shapes. But he also showed Sarah something disturbing. Among the ash and debris were traces of kerosene, carefully distributed throughout the building. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. And the faces in the floor weren't supernatural omens. They were evidence of a massacre that someone had carefully planned, possibly as revenge against a man whose empire was built on the broken bodies of working people. The investigation intensified over the following week as winter settled over Ashford. Dr. Blackwood established his temporary office in one of the estate's surviving outbuildings, while Sarah rented a room at Mrs. Price's inn and began interviewing townspeople. The official death toll stood at 17, but identifying the victims proved difficult. The fire's intensity had destroyed most remains beyond recognition, and the guest list had burned along with the mansion's office. Richard Thornton himself had survived, having left the gala early, complaining of illness, a detail that immediately aroused suspicion. He was now staying at his Boston residence, refusing to speak with investigators and hiding behind expensive lawyers who claimed their client was too traumatized to provide testimony. Sarah's journalism background gave her access that Henry's official position couldn't provide. She spent her days in Ashford's small library, combing through old newspapers and town records. What she discovered painted a disturbing picture of the Thornton family's history. Richard's father, James Thornton, had made the family fortune in the 1850s through railroad construction, but workers' rights groups had documented numerous accidents, wage theft, and dangerous conditions. In 1876, a tunnel collapse in western Massachusetts killed 43 men, and James Thornton had successfully avoided any legal consequences. The families of those workers had scattered across New England, many settling in small towns like Ashford, nursing grievances that had festered for over a decade. Meanwhile, Henry's technical investigation revealed more troubling details. The kerosene hadn't been stored at the estate for any legitimate purpose. It had been brought in specifically for the fire. Chemical analysis showed it was industrial grade, the type used in railroad maintenance yards. The locks on the main exits had been manipulated with tools, suggesting someone with mechanical knowledge had prepared them to fail. Most damning of all, Henry found evidence that the estate's fire detection system had been deliberately disabled hours before the blaze started. Someone had intimate knowledge of the building's layout and systems. This pointed to either current or former staff members, people who had worked within the mansion's walls and knew its vulnerabilities. Sarah made a breakthrough when she discovered records of a workers' advocacy group that had formed in 1878, calling itself the New England Labor Brotherhood. Its membership included survivors and families of those killed in Thornton railroad accidents. The group's leader was a man named Thomas Brennan, whose brother had died in the 1876 tunnel collapse. Thomas had worked briefly at Briar Hollow in 1885 as a groundskeeper before being dismissed, allegedly for insubordination. Mrs. Price, when pressed, admitted she remembered Thomas, a quiet, intense man who had been consumed by bitterness over his brother's death. He had been seen in Ashford the week before the fire, though he claimed to be visiting family. Now he was missing, having disappeared from his lodgings in Worcester the day after the Briar Hollow blaze. By late November, the investigation had become a manhunt. Local law enforcement, under pressure from Boston authorities and the Thornton family's influential friends, issued a warrant for Thomas Brennan's arrest. But Henry Blackwood wasn't convinced they had the full story. Yes, Brennan had motive and opportunity, but 17 people had died in that fire, including working-class servants and local townspeople who had nothing to do with railroad industry corruption. Would a man seeking justice for workers' deaths murder other workers? Henry's doubts deepened when he discovered that several of the gala's victims were members of reform movements, people who had been advocating for better labor conditions and investigating the Thornton business empire. Sarah pursued a different angle, focusing on the survivors. Besides Richard Thornton, 3 other people had escaped the fire. Margaret Thornton, Richard's wife, who claimed she had been in the garden when the blaze started. David Sterling, Richard's business partner and chief accountant. And Father Michael O'Connor, the priest who had been preparing to bless the gathering. Sarah interviewed each of them, noting inconsistencies in their accounts. Margaret seemed genuinely traumatized, but refused to explain why she had been outside in November evening cold without a coat. Sterling's timeline didn't match witness statements about when he claimed to have left the building. And Father O'Connor, usually talkative according to parishioners, had become withdrawn and silent, avoiding eye contact and cutting interviews short. The case took a dramatic turn when Mrs. Price approached Sarah late one night, clearly frightened. She revealed that her own son, William Price, had been part of the Labor Brotherhood and had known Thomas Brennan well. William had come to her 3 weeks before the fire, agitated and speaking about finally making things right and holding the powerful accountable. She hadn't understood what he meant until the mansion burned. Now William was dead, one of the 17 victims, and Mrs. Price was tormented by questions. Had her son been involved in planning the fire? Had he been a perpetrator who became a victim when the plan went wrong? Or had he discovered the plot and died trying to stop it or warn others? Henry and Sarah met that night at the ruins, where Henry had been conducting final forensic examinations. He showed her something he had kept from the official reports, a partially burned ledger he'd found in what remained of the estate's office. It contained financial records showing systematic fraud, with Richard Thornton and David Sterling embezzling from their own company while falsifying accident reports to avoid insurance payouts and liability. Dozens of worker deaths had been attributed to employee negligence when equipment failures were actually to blame. The ledger represented evidence that could destroy the Thornton empire and send both men to prison. Henry had initially assumed this ledger survived by accident, but now he wondered, what if someone had wanted it found? What if the fire was never about revenge, but about exposing corruption while eliminating witnesses who knew too much? December brought snow to Ashford, covering the Briar Hollow ruins in a white blanket that made the blackened remains look even more stark and desolate. The faces in the ash were now obscured, though local residents still avoided the site, whispering about curses and vengeful spirits. But Henry and Sarah were close to understanding the truth, and it was far more disturbing than any ghost story. They had learned that 3 weeks before the fire, Richard Thornton had discovered someone was investigating his financial records. A clerk in his Boston office had noticed unusual access to confidential files and reported it. Thornton had hired private investigators to identify the leak, and they had traced it to his own accountant, David Sterling. Sterling, it turned out, had grown a conscience. After 20 years of helping Thornton hide workplace deaths and steal from investors, he had contacted a reform journalist in Boston, planning to expose the entire operation. But he needed the physical ledgers as proof, and those were kept at Briar Hollow, in a fireproof safe in Richard Thornton's private study. The charity gala provided the perfect opportunity. The safe would be accessible, and security would be focused on protecting guests rather than monitoring the office areas. Sterling had planned to retrieve the ledgers that night, photograph them, and return them before anyone noticed, but someone else had other plans for Briar Hollow Estate. Sarah finally located Thomas Brennan in a boarding house outside Providence, Rhode Island. He was sick with pneumonia and clearly dying, his guilt and grief having consumed him. In his final interview, which Sarah recorded in her notebook with shaking hands, Thomas confirmed he had known about the fire, but he hadn't set it. William Price had come to him 2 weeks before the gala, explaining a plan that Thomas initially wanted to join, but ultimately couldn't support. William and 3 others from the Labour Brotherhood intended to start the fire, but only after ensuring all guests were safely evacuated. They would make it look like an accident, destroy the estate as a symbolic act, and in the chaos, Sterling would retrieve the evidence he needed. It was supposed to be property damage, not murder, but Thomas revealed something that changed everything. The plan had been betrayed. Someone had learned about the scheme and modified it, adding the kerosene accelerants, disabling the fire detection systems, and locking the exits. William Price and his companions had arrived that night, believing they were executing a carefully controlled plan, only to find themselves trapped along with everyone else when the fire spread with impossible speed. Thomas had stayed away that night precisely because he sensed something was wrong, but his warnings to William had been ignored. Now Thomas was dying of guilt, knowing that his refusal to act more decisively had cost 17 lives. As Sarah left his bedside, Thomas whispered one final truth. He knew who had betrayed the plan, who had turned a protest into a massacre. And that person, he said, had been at the gala that night, had walked out alive while others burned and was still free in Boston, protected by power and privilege. Sarah returned to Ashford with Thomas Brennan's dying confession weighing on her conscience. She found Henry at the ruins where fresh snow had transformed the disaster site into something almost peaceful. But there was no peace in what they now understood. The betrayer had to be one of the 3 survivors who had walked away unscathed: Margaret Thornton, David Sterling, or Father Michael O'Connor. Thomas had refused to name them directly, claiming he wanted Sarah to discover the truth through evidence rather than accusation, perhaps hoping that his own judgment might be wrong. But his final words echoed in her mind. Look for who had the most to lose if the truth came out, and who had the power to reshape a workers' protest into a massacre. Henry had continued his forensic work during Sarah's absence, and what he discovered supported an increasingly dark theory. The kerosene distribution pattern wasn't random. It had been carefully planned to create maximum casualties while appearing chaotic. The accelerant had been concentrated near exits and stairwells, ensuring that anyone trying to escape would be driven back into the flames. The fire detection system hadn't just been disabled. It had been sabotaged in a way that required detailed knowledge of its mechanisms, the kind of expertise that came from either employment at the estate or extensive consultation with someone who worked there. This wasn't the work of angry laborers seeking symbolic justice. This was calculated murder designed to look like radical violence. Margaret Thornton agreed to meet with Sarah at her Boston residence, a townhouse in Beacon Hill that spoke of old money and refined tastes. At 38, Margaret presented herself as the grieving wife, dressed in black mourning clothes, her face carefully composed. But as Sarah pressed her with questions, cracks appeared in her facade. Margaret admitted that her marriage to Richard had been troubled for years. She knew about the financial fraud, about the worker deaths, about the bribes paid to officials to cover up safety violations. She had considered leaving him, she said, but where would she go? A divorced woman with no income of her own had few options in 1889 Boston society. She had been in the garden that night, she insisted, because she needed air, needed to escape the hypocritical celebration of charity, while her husband's victims remained nameless and uncompensated. But Sarah noticed details that didn't align with Margaret's story. Her hands showed no signs of recent garden work or the cold damage one would expect from standing outside in November without adequate clothing. Her mourning dress was new, purchased after the fire, yet she claimed to have been too distraught to leave her home for weeks. Most tellingly, when Sarah mentioned William Price's name, Margaret's composure finally cracked. Her face went pale, and she demanded to know what Sarah had learned about William. It was the reaction of someone confronting an unexpected danger, not simple curiosity about a victim. Sarah pressed harder, and Margaret ended the interview abruptly, but not before revealing something crucial. She had known William Price personally. He had worked as a groundskeeper at Briar Hollow during her first years of marriage, and they had developed what she called a friendship based on shared frustration with Richard's cruelty. Henry, meanwhile, confronted David Sterling at the accountant's office in downtown Boston. Sterling was a nervous man in his 50s, prematurely grey, with the perpetual worry lines of someone who carried guilty secrets. He had returned to work remarkably quickly after the fire, Henry noted, for someone who had supposedly witnessed such horror. Sterling admitted immediately that he had been planning to expose Richard Thornton's fraud. He showed Henry copies of documents he had managed to secure before the fire, evidence of embezzlement, falsified safety reports, and bribery that stretched back 15 years. He had contacted reform journalists, he said, because he could no longer live with the weight of his complicity. But his story about the night of the fire kept changing. First he said he left before the fire started. Then he claimed he escaped through a servant's entrance. Then he suggested he might have been outside smoking when the blaze began. Henry pushed Sterling on the inconsistencies, and finally the accountant broke down. He confessed that he had been blackmailed. Someone had discovered his plan to expose Thornton and threatened to reveal Sterling's own embezzlement, money he had stolen to pay gambling debts years earlier. If he didn't cooperate with a modified version of events, he would go to prison along with Thornton. Sterling claimed he didn't know who was blackmailing him. The demands came through anonymous letters left at his office. But he admitted to one devastating act. He had provided detailed layouts of Briar Hollow estate to his blackmailer, including the locations of exits, the fire detection system, and the safe where the original ledgers were kept. He had thought he was just helping someone plan a burglary. He swore he never imagined it would be used to trap people in a burning building. Father Michael O'Connor was the hardest to locate. The Catholic diocese claimed he had taken a leave of absence for spiritual retreat, but Sarah's inquiries revealed he was staying at a monastery in rural Vermont, far from Boston and its newspapers. She and Henry made the journey in early December, traveling by train through snow-covered landscapes that seemed to mirror the cold heart of their investigation. The monastery sat on a hilltop, its stone walls ancient and imposing, a place built for contemplation and penance. The abbot who greeted them was sympathetic, but protective of his guest, warning them that Father O'Connor was in a fragile state and might not be able to help them. When they finally sat across from the priest in the monastery's sparse meeting room, Sarah understood what the abbot meant. Father O'Connor looked like he had aged a decade in the month since the fire. His hands trembled, his eyes were hollow, and he started at every sudden sound. But he was lucid. And when Henry explained that they knew the fire was murder and that someone had betrayed the Labour Brotherhood's plan, the priest's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. He had been waiting, he said, for someone to figure it out. He had been carrying the weight of truth alone, unable to speak because of the confessional seal, tortured by the knowledge that he could have prevented 17 deaths, but had remained silent. Father O'Connor's story unfolded in fragments, interrupted by long pauses as he struggled with the violation of trust his testimony represented. 3 weeks before the fire, A parishioner had come to confession and revealed a plan to burn Briar Hollow estate. The parishioner, whom the priest refused to name, citing the absolute sanctity of confession, had described it as an act of justice, a way to destroy the symbol of Thornton's corrupt power while exposing his crimes. The parishioner had been involved in planning, but had grown troubled by the scope of the conspiracy. The priest had counseled against violence, had urged the parishioner to seek legal remedies instead, but his words had fallen on desperate ears. 2 days before the gala, the same parishioner returned, this time in a state of panic. Something had gone wrong with the plan, they said. Someone else had learned about it and was going to turn the controlled fire into something far worse. The parishioner begged Father O'Connor for guidance, but what could the priest do without breaking the seal of confession? He couldn't go to the police without revealing his source. He couldn't warn Richard Thornton without explaining how he knew. He had prayed for wisdom, for some way to intervene that wouldn't violate his sacred duty. And in his paralysis, 17 people had burned to death. Now he was here, in this monastery, trying to reconcile his commitment to the confessional seal with the knowledge that his silence had enabled murder. Sarah carefully asked if the parishioner had survived the fire. Father O'Connor hesitated, then nodded. This single fact was crucial. It meant the person who had come to confession was one of the survivors, narrowing the suspect significantly. But which one? The priest couldn't say more without violating his vows, and despite Sarah's pressing, he remained firm on that boundary. However, he offered one final piece of information that changed everything. The parishioner had expressed fear not just for themselves, but for someone they loved who was also involved in the original plan. This detail suggested complicated relationships among the conspirators, bonds of affection or family that had been exploited by whoever had betrayed the Labour Brotherhood. Henry and Sarah left the monastery with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer picture of the crime. They now knew that one of the survivors had been part of the original protest plan, had tried to stop the betrayal, and had somehow escaped the fire despite the locked exits and accelerants. They knew that this person was protecting someone they loved, someone who had died in the flames. And they knew that the true murderer had to be someone with access to all of this information, someone who knew about the Labour Brotherhood, about Sterling's evidence gathering, about the estate's systems, and about the personal relationships that could be manipulated to ensure silence. The train ride back to Boston was quiet, both investigators lost in thought as winter landscape rolled past the windows. Sarah finally broke the silence with a theory that had been forming since the monastery visit. What if there had been 2 separate plots running simultaneously, the Labour Brotherhood's symbolic protest and evidence theft, and someone else's plan to use that protest as cover for mass murder? What if the real target wasn't just Richard Thornton's empire, but specific individuals at the gala who knew too much or threatened someone's interests? This would explain the locked exits, ensuring certain people couldn't escape, and the strategic placement of accelerants to drive victims away from safety. It would also explain why some people survived. They were never meant to die because they were useful to the true murderer, either as witnesses to support a false narrative or as scapegoats to carry blame. Back in Boston, Henry and Sarah compiled their evidence in Sarah's small apartment, covering the walls with notes, diagrams, and photographs from the investigation. They had pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its complete picture, and what they saw was more disturbing than either had imagined. The Briar Hollow fire hadn't been a radical attack gone wrong or a tragic accident. It had been a carefully orchestrated massacre, designed to eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence that couldn't be controlled, and consolidate power in the hands of someone willing to sacrifice innocent lives for personal gain. The breakthrough came when Sarah reviewed her notes from Margaret Thornton's interview, alongside the financial records Henry had retrieved from the ruins. Margaret had mentioned her friendship with William Price, but Sarah now noticed that Margaret had made regular payments to a charitable fund that Price administered, a fund supposedly for families of injured railroad workers. When Henry traced the fund's financial trail, they discovered it was fraudulent. The money Margaret had been donating wasn't going to workers' families. It was being funneled back to an account in Margaret's own name through a series of complex transfers. William Price had been helping Margaret embezzle from her own husband, siphoning off funds that Richard believed were going to legitimate charity. This revelation recast everything they knew. Margaret hadn't been a passive, trapped wife enduring her husband's corruption. She had been actively stealing from him, using William Price as her accomplice and the cover of charity work as her method. But why? Further investigation into Margaret's background revealed that she came from a once wealthy family that had lost everything in the financial panic of 1873. She had married Richard Thornton not for love, but for financial security, and over 15 years of marriage had rebuilt her own secret fortune through systematic theft. She had been planning to leave Richard, to start over somewhere new with enough money to live independently. William Price had been both her co-conspirator and, Sarah suspected, something more than a friend. The tragedy became clear. William Price had joined the Labour Brotherhood's plan genuinely believing it was about justice for workers, but also seeing it as an opportunity to retrieve evidence of his and Margaret's embezzlement that Richard's accountant Sterling might have uncovered. When the plan was betrayed and William died in the fire, Margaret had lost both her accomplice and someone she cared about deeply. But had she known about the betrayal beforehand? Had she perhaps been the one who modified the plan, eliminating William to prevent him from ever testifying about her theft, while also removing other potential witnesses who might have known about their relationship? Henry was skeptical of this theory. Margaret had wealth and an escape plan. Why would she risk everything by committing mass murder? The answer came from an unexpected source. Richard Thornton himself finally agreed to speak with investigators, arriving at Henry's temporary office with his lawyers, but clearly shaken by something that had spooked him. Thornton revealed that 1 week before the fire, he had discovered the truth about Margaret's embezzlement. His own private investigators had been tracking the money, and they had identified William Price as her accomplice. Thornton had confronted Margaret, and she had begged for mercy, claiming the money was insurance against being left destitute if he divorced her or died. Richard had agreed not to prosecute, but with conditions. Margaret would cease all contact with Price, return the money gradually through documented legitimate means, and remain in the marriage permanently, essentially becoming his prisoner. Margaret had appeared to accept these terms, Thornton said, but he now believed she had been planning something desperate. On the day before the gala, she had asked detailed questions about who would be attending, particularly which business associates and legal advisors would be present. She had also insisted that Richard leave early if he wasn't feeling well, encouraging him to prioritize his health over social obligations. When he had actually felt ill that night, a sudden stomach ailment that seemed to come from nowhere, Margaret had been the one to insist he go home immediately, practically pushing him out the door. Only later did Richard realize his illness had begun shortly after drinking wine that Margaret had personally brought to him. The picture was now complete, but proving it would be difficult. Margaret had poisoned her husband just enough to ensure he left the gala before the fire, protecting him not out of love, but because his death would have immediately triggered investigations into her finances. She had known about the Labour Brotherhood's plan because William Price had told her, trusting her with the information. She had betrayed that trust by sabotaging the plan, adding the accelerants and locking the exits herself, using knowledge gained from years of living at the estate. She had positioned herself in the garden, establishing an alibi while ensuring she could escape before the fire spread. And she had murdered William Price along with 16 others to protect her secret, eliminating anyone who might connect her to the embezzlement while making it look like radical violence. But Sarah had one final piece of evidence to gather. She returned to Mrs. Price, William's mother, and asked about her son's relationship with Margaret Thornton. The elderly woman, already broken by grief, finally admitted what she had been too ashamed to reveal before. William and Margaret had been lovers for years, carrying on an affair that violated every social boundary of class and propriety. Margaret had promised William they would be together once she secured enough money to leave Richard, and William had believed her. He had helped her steal, had protected her secrets, and had joined the Labour Brotherhood's plan, thinking it would somehow lead to their freedom. He had died never knowing that the woman he loved had betrayed him, had locked him inside Briar Hollow estate, and set it ablaze to cover her tracks. The confrontation happened on December 23, 1889, in Margaret Thornton's Beacon Hill townhouse. Sarah and Henry arrived with local police officers and a warrant for Margaret's arrest, armed with evidence that, while circumstantial, was compelling enough to force a trial. They found her in her sitting room, calmly drinking tea as if she had been expecting them. In a way, she had. Margaret Thornton was too intelligent not to know that eventually someone would unravel her carefully constructed lies, would see through the performance of the grieving wife and discover the calculating murderer beneath. Margaret didn't resist arrest, but she also didn't confess. Instead, she spoke to Sarah directly, woman to woman, in a conversation that Sarah would later struggle to transcribe accurately because of its chilling rationality. Margaret explained that she had spent 15 years married to a man who built his fortune on the broken bodies of workers, who bribed officials to avoid accountability, who treated human life as less valuable than profit margins. She had watched him destroy families and communities while society celebrated him as a captain of industry. And when she had tried to build her own security, her own possibility of freedom through money she had taken from his ill-gotten gains, he had trapped her again, turned her into a prisoner in her own home. William Price, Margaret said with what might have been genuine regret, had been collateral damage. She had cared for him in her way, but he had become a liability. He knew too much, and worse, he had believed too much, believed in justice, in the possibility that the powerful could be held accountable through legal means, in the righteousness of the Labour Brotherhood's cause. She couldn't risk him living to testify if the embezzlement was discovered. She couldn't trust that his conscience wouldn't eventually force him to reveal their relationship and her theft. So when he told her about the planned protest, she had seen an opportunity. She would turn their symbolic fire into a real catastrophe, eliminate William and anyone else who might connect her to the stolen money, and position herself as a victim while her husband's empire crumbled under the weight of scandal. The faces in the ash, those pareidolik patterns that had haunted Ashford's residence and launched the investigation, were just random formations with no supernatural significance. But Margaret spoke of them as if they were a kind of poetic justice, saying that the victims had marked the place of their death, forcing the world to look at what had happened, to ask questions that otherwise might have been buried along with the bodies. She seemed to believe that the investigation itself, the exposure of Richard Thornton's crimes and David Sterling's complicity, was worth the 17 lives she had taken. She had achieved what the Labour Brotherhood wanted. Thornton's empire was destroyed, his corruption exposed, his business partners under investigation, but through methods so horrific that any moral victory was negated by the massacre required to achieve it. Henry asked Margaret directly if she had any remorse. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. She regretted William's death, she said, because he had been good in a way that most people weren't. She regretted the deaths of the servants and townspeople who had no connection to Thornton's corruption, calling them unfortunate but necessary casualties of a war they didn't know they were fighting. But she felt no remorse for the business associates and legal advisors who had enabled Richard's crimes for years, who had profited from worker deaths, and then sat in Briar Hollow's ballroom drinking champagne and celebrating charity. They had known what Richard was, and they had helped him anyway. In Margaret's calculus, their deaths balanced some cosmic scale of justice. The trial of Margaret Thornton began in March 1890 and consumed Boston society for 3 months. The prosecution presented the evidence that Sarah and Henry had gathered, the financial records showing embezzlement, testimony from Mrs. Price about the affair, forensic analysis of the fire's origin points and the sabotaged safety systems, and Richard Thornton's account of being poisoned and manipulated into leaving the gala. The defense argued that Margaret had been psychologically damaged by years of abuse, that her husband's crimes had driven her to desperation, and that much of the evidence was circumstantial. Father O'Connor never testified, maintaining the seal of confession even under subpoena, though his refusal to testify spoke volumes to those who understood its implications. The jury deliberated for 2 weeks before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: 17 counts of murder in the first degree, arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, and embezzlement. Margaret Thornton was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that would be carried out in the women's section of the state prison in October 1890. In the months between verdict and execution, Margaret gave a series of interviews to Sarah, speaking frankly about her crimes, her motivations, and her complete lack of faith that the legal system would ever have held her husband accountable without the dramatic violence she had orchestrated. These interviews became the basis for Sarah's book, published in 1891, which exposed the full scope of corruption in Massachusetts' railroad industry and contributed to significant labor reform legislation. The Briar Hollow estate was never rebuilt. The property remained a ruin, gradually being reclaimed by nature. The faces in the ash floor eventually eroded by weather and time, until nothing remained but broken stone and the memory of tragedy. Richard Thornton's railroad empire collapsed under the weight of scandal and investigation. His assets seized to compensate victims' families, though no amount of money could truly balance the scales. David Sterling testified against numerous other corrupt officials and businessmen in exchange for a reduced sentence, serving 5 years in prison before disappearing into obscurity. Father O'Connor never recovered from his crisis of conscience, eventually leaving the priesthood to work in settlement houses, spending the rest of his life trying to serve the poor and working-class communities whose suffering he felt he had failed to prevent. Sarah Winter's career as an investigative journalist flourished following the case, and she became one of the first women to gain national recognition in the field. Henry Blackwood continued his work as a fire investigator, but the Briar Hollow case haunted him, a reminder that forensic science could reveal how a crime occurred, but not always prevent the human capacity for calculated cruelty. And in Ashford, the small town where it all began, residents eventually stopped talking about supernatural faces in the ash and started remembering the real victims, 17 people who died because one woman decided that her freedom and revenge were worth more than their lives, and because a system that enabled powerful men's crimes had left her with no faith that justice could be achieved through lawful means. The tragedy became a cautionary tale not about curses or ghosts, but about the human cost of corruption, inequality, and the desperate measures people take when they believe the world offers them no other choice. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.